I want to just throw out a few points that might be interesting to those who are listening, if they are especially interested in the history of education, both in the East and in the Muslim world and in the European realms in the West. Now, historians such as Marshall Hodgson, Wa'il Hallaq, George Saliba, they've pointed out how there was in Europe, in the early modern period, what Marshall Hodgson calls a great Western transmutation, a change in European societies that ultimately came to dominate and affect other societies, Muslim and otherwise. When it comes to education and knowledge in society, I think there's a handful of major historical shifts that, again, scholars such as Hallaq and Saliba have pointed out, that are important when we think about the purpose of a madrasa education and how it's been transformed in the modern world, in the contemporary world. The first historical shift is in the very meaning of science. Okay, George Saliba, for example, has pointed out in some of his lectures and writings how the understanding of science shifted from an Aristotelian certainty, in other words, seeking out knowledge that a person can be certain of, ultimately rooted in the divine, similar to what we just heard from Subki, for example, a few minutes ago, to knowledge as a producer of capital and knowledge as a type of investment. In other words, it's a change from how we understand the very purpose of knowledge. And this happened at the same time in the early 16th and early 17th century, for example, in which new institutions were developed in Europe, such as academies and royal societies, the development of things like the patent, in which a person could own knowledge. So for example, the famous scientist Galileo Galilei, he sells the Medici stars. In other words, he capitalizes on his scientific investments. Knowledge, in other words, is commercialized. Okay, so we've gone from knowledge being a moral enterprise to being a commercial, mercantilistic enterprise. We shift from colleges to universities. Okay, so whereas the type of institution that we've been talking about, the madrasa, the college, even in Europe in the 13th and 14th century, following very similar patterns where it's master to student, in the 16th and 17th centuries, we have a shift to the university as being the institution that grants, as George Maqdisi and others have outlined, that it's no longer the master of the college who certifies the student, but it's the institution that certifies the student. And in the 19th century, we see a shift to the modern research university, the goal of which is no longer to produce the type of scholars we talked about earlier in the pre-modern Muslim understanding, but more limited professionals who can serve, especially in this more commercialized understanding of knowledge and in a newly professionalized scientific setting of the 19th and 20th centuries, in an industrialized setting in which the state is the ultimate, not the divine, but the state determines what is the right use of society as society's energies and resources. So in other words, an instrumentalist approach to knowledge, and knowledge especially of the natural world and of man. We have a shift in the 16th and 17th century likewise from an emphasis on knowledge being ordered, there being a hierarchy of knowledge, to rather a curriculum. Curriculum here being a reconfiguring concept in which, in light with Calvinist understandings of society in the 16th and 17th century, there was an idea that education must become universal, mass education must be controlled by the state, newly liberated from Catholic Rome, and that the ultimate purpose of this mass education should be to produce an objective science within a bureaucracy managed by the state. A form of education, so a curriculum, a course, taken from the idea that like a course that horses would run through, managed by the state, that is teacher-proof. So we've shifted from the center of education being the teacher-student relationship to an understanding of education that is state-controlled, in which the teacher is just a dispenser of education. So it's an apersonal, a non-personal pedagogy. Again, for what objective? For the objective of a centralized, powerful state controlling society. And finally, the final shift, drawing on the research of Wa al-Hallaq, who himself draws very heavily on Al-Ghazali and on others like Foucault, a shift from Tazkiya, or internal ta'deeb and discipline, which we talked about earlier, to as the way of changing the human soul, in other words, internal discipline, Tazkiya, to coercion or state discipline. So in other words, an erasure of all institutions and all the practices of institutions that existed in the pre-modern world, like the tekke, like the zawiya and the khaniqah, and in some countries in the 20th century, a literal erasure by closing the tekkes and zawiyas, and replacing them with the state, and state coercion as a form of social control. The state is the guarantor, in other words, of a more secular paradise on earth. And so what Wa al-Hallaq outlines here, and this is the final point perhaps that we'll begin to close with, is that we've shifted from internal self-regulation of the soul and of the self and of the body to an externally imposed regulation. So now the madrasa and the tekke no longer serve the role that they used to, and the state and its forms of education and control and discipline take its place. And here, of course, we no longer need then the master, be it a master of ta'aleem or a master of ta'deeb, because their roles have been usurped by state education.